Thank you, Brett. So what I'd like to talk about today is what's the point of educational research? I, like many other people in universities, produce educational research all the time. And I think most of us really have rather naive views about educational research. And so what I'd like to do in the 15 minutes or so that I have here today is just to talk about what I think is the best role for educational research and how it can provide a bridge between the work of academics and the work of practitioners. So my talk is in three sections, really. The first is two extreme views about educational research. The second bit will be about why what works in education won't work. And the third bit is what is the role of research in education. So I think, to begin with, there really seem to be two extreme views on education and research. The first is the kind of what works approach. The idea is that the job of researchers is to figure out what works in education and then to tell teachers what to do, and teachers do it, and things get better. The trouble is that, as I've often said, what works is the wrong question in education because everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere. At the other extreme, you've got the view that education is not that kind of thing that research can help. In other words, teachers just need to figure out for themselves, they need to find out through action research what works for them in their own context, in their own classrooms. And that educational research can't help in that activity. I think both of those extremes are unhelpful. And so what I'd like to try to do is to map out a kind of middle ground where we can figure out what educational research can and can't do for education. So the traditional model of educational research is that any findings from educational research are really independent of who does the research. In other words, you don't need to know who conducted the research, you just need to know how the research was conducted, and that tells you everything you need to know. The idea then is that research findings have the same meanings to different people, and the same research findings will work across all relevant contexts. And as John Zinman suggested many years ago, the idea of traditional research is that it produces knowledge without a knower. There's just this decontextualized truth that we can apply in educational settings. And so the traditional model is that researchers find out stuff, they communicate these findings to teachers, teachers incorporate these findings into their practice, and things get better. And that kind of model for research does actually have some benefits. So for example, in the United States, in the 1970s, it was believed that the use of antiarrhythmic drugs would be useful to help people recover from heart attacks. And some experiments showed that they worked, some evidence shows that they didn't work. But in the early 1980s, a collection of the research studies was analyzed together. And what they discovered was the use of these drugs was roughly increasing the rate of mortality by about 14%. So there's a clear finding from research that basically the use of antiarrhythmic drugs in people who've had heart attacks is a bad idea. And now that those things are not administered at all. Another good example is the research on cot death. And again, for many years it was believed, Benjamin Spock, the doctor, advised that babies should sleep on their stomachs. And it wasn't until the 1980s that all the research was assembled together. And now it's very clear that the risk of sudden infant death syndrome or cot death is much greater if babies sleep on their stomachs. So the advice is back to sleep, get babies to sleep on their backs. So research can provide clear findings that way. What I want to suggest is that those situations are very rare in education. So education rarely produces that kind of information. It's highly effective when you can actually reduce what we know to propositions. What I want to suggest is that most of the knowledge of expert teachers is not that kind of knowledge. So I can explain to somebody how to solve an equation. I can't explain to somebody how to ride a bicycle. And I think the knowledge that expert teachers have is more like the knowledge of how to ride a bicycle than it is the knowledge of how to solve an equation. And that's why telling teachers what to do doesn't work. just to be clear, if there was a way of telling teachers what to do with a guarantee that students would learn more, I would do it in a heartbeat. And if I had the power to do so, I would fire any teacher who disobeyed me. The reason I don't think we can tell teachers what to do is not because I want to be nice to teachers, it's because it doesn't work. The kind of knowledge that expert teachers have is not that kind of knowledge, and therefore teachers have to figure out what this means in their own classroom. So research can't tell teachers, and this of course leads some people to a council of despair, and they say, well, we can't do anything. But I think that on the other hand, we do need research to help teachers figure out what are the smart ways to invest their time and what are the less smart ways to invest their time. So for example, research has shown that there appears to be very little benefit from learning styles. So many years ago, teachers on teacher training courses were told to customize their teaching to match their students' preferred learning styles. And this has been researched quite extensively. Now, some scientists say that there's no such thing as learning styles. I'm not that convinced. I'm open to the idea that there may be different styles of learning. But what we do know right now is that there is no evidence that customizing teaching to match in with a student's preferred learning style has any impact on how much that student learns and may actually make things worse. So research, there's a clear finding there. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't find different ways of thinking about learning styles that have some utility in the future. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But I think it does suggest to teachers that it's highly unlikely that spending time thinking about customizing teaching to match a student's learning style preference is going to help. The other thing that research can do is help us understand when teachers modify techniques to make them work in their own classroom. Do they make them more powerful or less powerful? And there's an interesting case study here in the work on cooperative and collaborative learning. So we now know from the work of the Johnson brothers and Robert Slavin and others that group work does seem to improve student learning when two conditions are met. The first is that there are group goals, students are working as a group, not just in a group. And the second is individual accountability. Each member of the group is responsible to the group for putting in their best efforts. And when those two conditions are met, then we know that it's pretty likely that learning will be enhanced. However, most teachers who, according to one study, only probably about 80% of the teachers who said they did group work did not do these two things. So we can actually use research to find out under what circumstances does this work, and therefore to help make sure that teachers understand when this is effective and when it's not. So the role of research, really, this idea that we should have evidence-based practice, becomes a continuum rather than a category. Politicians like to hear about evidence-based practice as if there is evidence-based practice and not evidence-based practice, but I don't think it's that simple. There's a continuum, and as I said earlier, research can indicate areas where improvements are unlikely to improve education. They can actually provide evidence about what factors need to be in place for the intervention to be successful. They can provide information about how much of an improvement you're going to get if this innovation or intervention is implemented. And it can also provide costs, so we can begin to make smarter decisions about what to investigate. And so it seems to me that the role of teachers, therefore, is to continue to work with the ideas that they come across in their reading, and to understand that research will never tell you what to do. The point is that classrooms are far too complex for research ever to say in education, this is always the right thing to do. What research can indicate is this is likely to be a profitable place to invest your efforts, and this is likely to be a less profitable place to invest your efforts. And so these things, I think, can be very powerful. The research on cost-benefit analyses tells us that class size reduction is very expensive and has small effects for older children. It has larger effects for younger children. But even there, you need to understand the circumstances. So, for example, the classic study on class size reduction, the Tennessee class size study, found that with smaller classes in kindergarten and first grade in the United States, students made more progress, and these gains were maintained through to the end of high school. They were more likely to graduate high school if they'd been taught in a smaller class in kindergarten and first grade. But what's interesting about the Tennessee STAR study is that it was done in a very small part of Tennessee. The point is that they actually needed at least 70 students in a grade for this to work properly, because they wanted to have in each school one small class, 15 to 17 students, one larger class, 25 or so students, and another class, a larger class, taught with a teacher and a teacher's assistant. And that meant that smaller rural schools did not participate. In other words, the schools that actually participated in the Tennessee STAR study were not representative of all the schools in Tennessee. And yet this is held up as a model of the classic randomized controlled trial. The idea is that we're told that this is the classic model, but it may not apply to rural schools. The other thing that's important about the Tennessee STAR study is that the whole experiment only required about 50 extra teachers to be employed. And it's reasonable to assume that the extra teachers were of comparable quality to the ones who were already working. But if teacher recruitment is a challenge in a particular area, then class size reduction can actually make things worse, because it means you actually have to give jobs to people who previously wouldn't have been employed as teachers because they weren't good enough. So what's really interesting is even in the best randomized controlled trials that have been conducted, Frederick Mostella, a statistician, regarded this as one of the kind of best designed educational experiments ever conducted. There are real problems in maintaining the randomization, the fidelity of implementation, and replication elsewhere. Just one other side note, it does appear that the parents of some of the middle class parents found out about this experiment and managed to persuade school administrators to move their children into the smaller classes. So some of the extra performance of the smaller classes may have been due to a drift of middle class students from the larger classes to the smaller classes. This is not to denigrate educational research. It is just to reinforce the fact that it's really hard to conduct educational experiments in such a way that produce relevant, meaningful data. So what does this mean for educational research? Well, I think that all teachers should be seeking to improve their practice. I think that one of the most powerful things we can do in education is to get rid of this evaluative culture where we try to figure out who the good teachers are, who the less good teachers are, give bonuses to the better teachers, and get rid of the lower performing teachers. First of all, we aren't able to determine the quality of teachers with any accuracy to make that a fair process. But secondly, it creates competition between teachers for those bonuses. So the first idea here is that every single teacher should be trying to get better. Not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better. So the non-negotiable would be, if you're a teacher in Australia or indeed in any other country, you are getting better. The second thing is that then there should be an encouragement to work with other teachers to improve. I'm not saying that has to be the case, but I'm saying it's better if it is the case. I think some teachers might then want to write up their work for publication, and some may even want to pursue research degrees at universities, for example. Those are all optional. The non-negotiable is that every single teacher should be trying to get better. The role of education researchers then is to support that process. So I see the major role of education researchers as not working in universities to come up with ideas about how to improve schools, but to work with teachers to try to figure out how to make the findings from particular inquiries translatable. I define research as attempts at inquiry that transcend the context of data collection. So if I find out what works in my classroom for me, I wouldn't call that research. But if I work with others to try to make sure that those findings are relevant and helpful to others, then I think that is actually becoming research. So I think the role of researchers is to work with teachers to inquire in such a way as to help figure out what of what this teacher did in this classroom might be translatable elsewhere by looking at the theory. So this means that ultimately there cannot be a kind of top-down research-based approach to education. I think school teachers and school leaders need to become critical consumers of educational research. So when somebody shows you a research finding, you think, well, okay, does this solve a problem I have? It could be that this research study solved a problem that you didn't have, or you've already solved. The second question is, how much extra learning will we get? For many years, psychologists and education researchers just said the result was significant. And what I'm saying is that's not good enough. We need to know how much extra learning. And actually, I don't think effect sizes are much use because nobody understands what they mean. I think we should strive, even though it's difficult, to express our results in the form of extra months of learning per year. So when teachers did this, the students made this much more progress in a year. The third thing is, how much will it cost? People often say, well, if you don't get a decent effect size, it's not worth doing. But I would say that we're not going to find big results in that way. What we can do is provide lots of small things that will give us a small edge. And that's why sometimes small effects that are inexpensive to secure can be very effective. And the other thing is, it's not just the cost, it's the cost in terms of teachers' time and students' time. There's only a certain number of hours in the day, and therefore, every time we look at an intervention, we say, well, what else can we do with the time? And so there's no more hours in the day, but what we can do is to say, for each hour that we spend as teachers, as students, could that hour have been spent in a different way that would have resulted in even more learning? And then finally, and this may be the most important question, is can it be implemented here? Because too many of the solutions that are proposed to improve education look fine in some contexts, but are completely useless in other contexts, where the culture doesn't support it, where the physical location, the geographical isolation doesn't support it. So I think that fourth question, can it be implemented here, is the really essential question for practically using the research wisely. So to summarize, does this solve the problem we have? How much extra learning will we get if we do it and it works? How much will it cost? And can it be implemented here? And I think if teachers and researchers work together on those kinds of questions, if teachers are critical consumers of educational research, if researchers accept that teachers need to produce knowledge for themselves, then I think we can have very productive partnerships between teachers and researchers.